The emergency room was louder than usual for a Tuesday evening. Nurses moved with focused urgency, doctors gave orders in calm but clipped voices, and somewhere near the back bay, the mechanical hiss of a ventilator punctuated the air. Nora Alvarez barely noticed. She had long since trained herself to hear everything and respond only to what mattered most. She tightened the tourniquet on a man's arm, glanced at the monitor, and nodded to a tech. "This one's stable. Transfer to observation once you're cleared." Her voice was steady, but her eyes flicked to the trauma bay beyond the curtain. Something in the charge nurse's tone when she'd called for help had put her on edge. Nora stepped away, stripped off her gloves, and pushed through the swinging doors. Inside, chaos coiled around the body on the table. Male, late 30s maybe, unconscious, pallid, and losing blood too fast for the trauma team to keep up. A head wound crusted darkly near his temple, his ribs uneven from blunt force. His clothes had been cut away. No wallet, no ID, just the jagged pieces of a man the world didn't seem to know. Car hit him on the corner of 6th and Blythe. Witness said he pushed a kid out of the way, one of the paramedics muttered. No name, no phone, nothing. BP's crashing, Dr. Brenner said. We're not stabilizing with fluids alone, we need ONEG now. We're out, the blood bank tech called. All gone. We used the last of it on that twin birth hemorrhage half an hour ago. The next shipment's not here for another hour. Nora didn't think I'm ONEG. Every eye turned to her, startled. You sure? Dr. Brenner asked. Yes, she was already rolling up her sleeve. They led her to the back, drew her blood fast and clean, no questions. The second it filled, it was run across the hall. Nora sat there, arms still tingling, watching the swing of doors close behind the tech as he disappeared into the trauma bay again. The man's life, whoever he was, flowed along the thin red river she had offered without hesitation. Hours passed before the adrenaline wore off. The man survived, though barely. He had no ID, no fingerprints on file, no one coming to ask after him. For 2 weeks he remained in a coma. Nora checked on him every shift, quietly. She told herself it was habit, curiosity, maybe just a nurse's compulsion to see things through. She sat beside him once during a night shift when the lights were low and the ward had fallen into a kind of hush only exhaustion could make. His face looked softer then, the tension gone from his brow, the swelling eased. She wondered what kind of life he'd lived to leap in front of a car for a stranger, and what it meant that no one had come to claim him. I hope you wake up, she said softly. Somewhere someone should know your name. He woke 3 days later, confused, afraid, in pain. When the nurses tried to speak with him, he barely answered. At first, he couldn't remember anything. Not his name, not the accident, not the hospital. It was like looking at the world through water, blurred, strange, too far away. They assigned a social worker, began the process of re-identification. But the man, John Doe, they called him, said little, only that he felt like he'd been running from something, that maybe it was better if he didn't remember. Nora didn't push. She brought him his meds, sat at the foot of his bed when he couldn't sleep, and once gently held his hand when he was trembling after a nightmare. Their eyes met, and she saw a flicker of something then, recognition, maybe not of her but of kindness, something old and aching in him that reached toward her like a tired branch. He left the hospital weeks later, finally well enough to walk again. A name had come to him one morning, Evan, and with it the beginning of memory, not all at once but enough to start over. The social worker helped him apply for new documents. The case was closed. Nora watched him leave with quiet hope. He turned at the door and gave her a nod, small, grateful, like the echo of a moment never spoken aloud. And then he was gone. Time, as it always did in the hospital, moved on, wounds stitched, children born, lives ended. Nora worked double shifts some weeks, sometimes went days without seeing the sun. There were always new patients, new heartbreaks, and small victories carried home in the seams of her scrubs. She didn't forget him, but she folded him away in the drawer of memories she didn't open often. Spring came, then summer, and with it change. The hospital underwent renovations. There were rumors of a new director coming in, someone to take over the department, someone sharp and well-connected. Nora didn't care much for gossip. She had people to care for, charts to fill, veins to find in arms too fragile for their years. On a bright Monday morning, the ER buzzed with extra chatter. The new department head had arrived. People stood straighter. Nurses whispered. Nora stood by the nurse's station, reviewing a patient's vitals when she felt someone step beside her. "Excuse me," the man said, deep-voiced and calm. "I'm looking for Nora Alvarez." She looked up and froze. Evan stood there dressed in a sharp navy suit, a staff badge clipped to his chest with his full name. Dr. Evan Mercer, MD, ER Department Director. He held a clipboard in one hand, but his gaze was locked on hers, equal parts wonder, disbelief, and something deeper. something stunned and searching. "I believe we've met," he said softly. Around them, the noise of the ER faded, and Nora's heart beat against her ribs like a bird trying to remember how to fly. Nora's hand tightened around the patient chart she held, knuckles whitening slightly, though her voice stayed even. "I think so," she said. Dr. Evan Mercer didn't smile in that moment, not exactly. It was more like something unspooled from his expression, a soft, startled recognition, like hearing a song he hadn't known he missed. For a second, neither of them moved. Then the hallway around them seemed to remember itself and bloomed with noise again, pages being called, monitors beeping, footsteps scurrying past. "I'll be joining you for rounds," he said, as if she were just another nurse and this were just another hospital. And maybe it was, maybe it had to be. But when Nora turned and led him down the hallway, pointing out the new placement since construction, she felt the weight of the distance between them, not the physical steps, but the space that had stretched quietly across the months. He didn't speak again until they reached the trauma pod, where a patient groaned softly behind a curtain. "Can I ask you something?" he said, low enough that only she could hear. Nora hesitated, then nodded. "Was it really you," he asked, "the blood that night?" She met his eyes, yes. He inhaled slowly as though trying to fold the words around something bigger. "I remember flashes, not everything, but I remember pain and then peace. Like I was falling and someone caught me. I never knew if that part was real." "It was," she said. The curtain shifted then. A new patient arrived and the moment was gone like steam on glass. Over the next week, Evans settled into his role as ER director. He made changes gradually, redistributing staff schedules to ease burnout, adding a second psych consult in the evenings, pushing for funding for a grief liaison program Nora had proposed over a year ago but never expected to see approved. He moved through the department like someone who didn't just want to manage it, he wanted to understand it. The way pain lived in these walls. The way hope refused to leave, even after midnight. He kept his distance from Nora at first, professionally always, but sometimes she'd catch him watching her. Not in the way of a boss checking boxes, but as if her presence steadied him somehow, like the shape of something familiar in an unfamiliar room. Late one Thursday, she found him in the break room alone, sleeves rolled up, eyes distant as the coffee machine sputtered behind him. "Long day?" she asked. "Longest this week," he said with a tired grin. She poured herself some coffee and leaned against the counter beside him. "You're doing well, you know, people like working under you." "That's a relief," he said, then quieter, "especially from you." She glanced at him. "Why me?" "Because you saw me when I didn't even know who I was." He looked down at his hands, flexed them once. "I think I keep waiting for the moment it all comes rushing back, the life I lived before, but it hasn't, not fully. I know who I am now, I know medicine, leadership, I know what it means to work in a place like this, but the rest, it's fragmented." Nora sipped her coffee. "Maybe that's not a bad thing." He turned to her. "Maybe it's a chance," she said, "to choose which parts of yourself to carry forward." There was a pause then, tender and uncertain. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "if people are sent to us in the middle of our worst moments so we'll remember how to be human again?" "All the time." Their hands brushed, just a light, accidental thing, but neither of them moved away. The next few weeks passed like that, slow shifts in rhythm. The hospital hummed with its usual ache and beauty, but underneath, something quieter unfolded. Evan walked rounds with her more often, listened longer, asked questions no one else thought to ask. Nora, in turn, found herself softening around him as though some old tension in her chest had begun to loosen. She told herself it was just proximity, professionalism. Then one night, everything changed. It was just past midnight. Rain painted the windows in sheets. A trauma came in: motorcycle accident, teen rider, no helmet. Nora was first on the scene, Evan just behind her. They worked seamlessly, her hands quick and sure, his voice calm and commanding. For a moment they were nothing but instincts in motion. The boy's heart stopped. Evan took over compressions, sweat blooming across his brow. Nora administered meds, called for another unit of blood, and watched the monitor like it was a prayer. After 11 minutes, the boy's heart flickered back. The staff exhaled as one. They stepped outside the room, both damp with adrenaline and rain from earlier calls. "I thought we'd lose him," Evan said quietly. "But we didn't," Nora replied. He looked at her then, eyes raw with something that went deeper than gratitude. "I used to think the worst day of my life was the one I can't remember, but I think now it might have been the beginning of something that mattered more than whatever came before." She didn't answer, but he didn't need her to. That night, Nora lay in bed and thought of the way he had looked at her, not like someone remembering a debt, but like someone remembering himself through her. The soft weight of that realization settled over her like a hand on the heart. She had saved his life, and now slowly he was becoming part of hers. Summer deepened into the kind of humid heat that stuck to your skin even after sunset. Inside the hospital, the air conditioners buzzed and patients kept coming, fainting from heat exhaustion, falling off scaffolding, collapsing under grief. Nora moved through it all like she always had, quietly capable, her presence grounding, her hands steady even when her heart was. Something was shifting between her and Evan, but neither of them gave it a name. They exchanged glances during morning rounds, lingered a moment too long in supply closets while discussing patient charts, shared coffees that arrived without asking who wanted what. But their conversations never crossed the invisible line between familiar and intimate, though they hovered at the edge of it more and more often. One Friday, after a shift that ended later than expected, Nora found a note folded neatly on her locker shelf. Her name written in a hand she recognized. You once said people are sent to us in our worst moments so we'll remember how to be human again. I think you're still reminding me. Dinner this weekend, no expectations, just two people who survived something together. Yeah. She stared at it for a long moment, fingers grazing the paper's edge before tucking it into her bag. That night she said yes. They met outside the hospital, which felt almost surreal. Evan wasn't wearing scrubs and his hair, usually slicked back from a day in trauma, had fallen a little out of place in the evening breeze. Nora wore a simple navy dress, one she hadn't dusted off in months, maybe years. She felt both exposed and unseen at once, unsure of how to hold herself outside the fluorescent light of their usual world. He took her to a quiet restaurant near the river. Not fancy, just warm. They sat by the window and watched the water catch the last of the sun's light. Conversation flowed with surprising ease. He asked about her childhood, grew up in a small town with a single mom who worked two jobs and still packed her a lunch every day. She asked about his earliest memory, falling off a bike when he was 10, no helmet, a scar still tucked behind his left ear. Funny, he said, smiling, that scar stuck around even when everything else didn't. After dinner, they walked slowly along the waterfront. The city shimmered quietly around them, but their steps were unhurried. She could feel the nearness of him, the way his presence no longer felt unfamiliar but something she'd grown used to, even sought out. At one point he stopped, turning toward her with something more serious in his gaze. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Of course." "I wasn't always the man you met in that hospital bed," he said. "Before the accident I was sharp, driven but cold, I think. I chased success like it was the only thing worth knowing. I pushed people too hard, I didn't believe in softness." Nora didn't interrupt. "But when I woke up," he continued, "and found out someone gave their own blood to save me, before even knowing my name, it changed something. And then every day after that, watching the way you worked, how you cared, it's like I saw what I could be, who I want to be now." Her heart tightened, quiet and aching. "I don't want to forget that man," he added, voice lower, "but I want to keep becoming this one, with you maybe, if you'll let me." Nora looked up at him, her eyes full of a gentle wariness she'd learned from years of giving too much, too often. But also something else, something tender and slowly blooming. "You're not the only one who's changed," she said. The space between them narrowed, and when he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. They didn't kiss that night, not yet, but something passed between them unspoken and whole, like a promise not yet made but already lived into. Over the next few weeks they found a rhythm. They kept their connection quiet, professional during the day, personal in the stolen hours between shifts. They shared dinners, traded stories in parked cars, sent each other texts filled with small jokes and late-night thoughts. It wasn't grand or dramatic, it was something softer, earned. But not everyone kept their eyes to themselves. It started with a whisper in the break room. A nurse asked Nora if she was seeing anyone. Someone else mentioned Evan had been leaving the hospital at the same time she had more often than not. Nora brushed it off, smiling politely, but her chest felt tight. Then came the meeting. The hospital board had caught wind of rumors, concerns about professionalism, about optics. Evan was called in first, then Nora. They sat her down and asked direct questions. She answered honestly but carefully. Yes, she and Dr. Mercer were acquainted outside work. No, it hadn't affected patient care. No, it had not begun while he was under her medical care. Still, they issued a recommendation. Either end the relationship or submit a formal declaration and accept a reassignment, one of them to another department. Afterward, Evan found her sitting alone in the stairwell between floors, arms resting on her knees. "Didn't realize we'd become gossip," he said gently. She gave a humorless laugh. It's a hospital, people talk. He sat beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. I'll request reassignment, he said finally. You shouldn't have to uproot your work because of me. No, her voice was firm. You're doing good here. People need you. You belong. He looked at her, brow furrowed. So do you. I've always belonged, she said. I'll keep belonging wherever they send me. He reached for her hand. She let him hold it. This isn't fair, he said quietly. No, she agreed, but we don't get to choose all the terms of our lives, just how we show up in them. For now, they would keep their jobs, keep doing the work, but the decision lingered. Something would have to give. Nora stared at the door ahead, steel and cold. You know, she said, voice steady, if this had happened before the accident, you would have walked away. He was silent for a beat, then he nodded. You're right. And no. He turned toward her, expression soft with certainty. I stay. Autumn arrived with a quiet shift in light. The air thinned, crisping at the edges, and the trees outside the hospital began their slow turn to gold. Inside, life pulsed on, familiar and urgent. Nora transferred to the surgical recovery unit at her own request. It wasn't far, just a floor above the ER, but the difference was felt immediately. Fewer traumas, longer patient stays, a softer rhythm. She missed the intensity of emergency medicine, but part of her welcomed the space. The quiet let her breathe differently. Evan didn't fight her decision, though she saw the way his eyes lingered the first time they passed in the elevator after the move. He didn't say much, just offered a nod, a half smile, but something about it stayed with her through the rest of the day. They kept seeing each other, not as often, not as easily, but enough to know neither of them had walked away. Sometimes they met for breakfast before shifts, trading silence and warm coffee. Other times, Evan would appear in the surgical ward under the guise of checking in on a joint patient, but Nora knew. He was just making sure she was still there, still them. Then one afternoon, it happened. A woman arrived through the ER in respiratory failure. Her husband trailed behind, panicked, clutching an envelope of test results. The diagnosis was advanced, an aggressive lymphoma, undiagnosed until now. She was rushed into surgery for a biopsy, then placed in Nora's care in recovery. Her name was Tessa Mercer. The same last name stopped Nora mid-step when she first read the chart. It could have been coincidence. She told herself not to overthink. But when Evan walked in, pale and stunned, and stood at the foot of Tessa's bed without saying a word, she understood. She's my sister, he said quietly after a moment. Nora said nothing. She reached for his hand and held it. That night he came to her apartment for the first time. Not for dinner, not for comfort in the usual sense, just to sit, to not be alone. She made tea. They didn't turn on the lights. Outside, the wind rustled the trees and the city shimmered in the distance. He sat on her couch, eyes fixed on nothing, and let the silence hold him. She's all I had left, he said eventually. After the accident, when I didn't know anything, her name came first, then her face. I remembered holding her hand after our father died, how she wouldn't let go. He looked up, eyes red, and now this. Nora sat beside him, curling her knees to her chest. You don't have to do this alone. I don't want you to carry it either. She shook her head. That's what love is, Evan, not carrying someone's pain for them, just with them. Something in him unraveled then, not loudly. Just a soft collapse, like a man finally letting himself be human after holding too much for too long. Tessa's condition was aggressive. Chemotherapy began within days. Nora saw her daily on the ward in treatment, sometimes just sitting quietly by the window while the world tilted forward outside. She was kind, curious, sharp. She made jokes about hospital food, asked after the nurses by name. Evan visited every night, sometimes before closing meetings, sometimes long after hours. One evening, Tessa pulled Nora aside while Evan was on a call. He talks about you like your sunlight, she said, a sly smile curving her mouth. Nora flushed. He's important to me. I figured, the way you look at each other, it's like you're building something, even if you don't know what to call it yet. Nora glanced at the closed door, then back. He's been through a lot. And so have you, Tessa said softly. Don't forget that. The weeks wore on. Tessa had good days, bad days, and days that bent somewhere in between. Evan split himself between hospital leadership and sisterly devotion. Nora watched him wear both roles with impossible grace, even when it frayed him at the edges. One night after visiting hours, he arrived at Nora's door soaked from a sudden rainstorm. She wrapped him in a blanket and made him sit. They talked little that night. Instead, she rested her head on his shoulder while he let his grief press quietly against her without words. Later, when he finally slept on her couch, arm draped over his eyes, Nora sat beside him and watched him breathe. She thought about how odd and miraculous life was, how a man could enter your world broken and nameless and somehow become the person who saw you more clearly than anyone else ever had. Weeks passed, Tessa showed signs of progress. The tumor shrank, her vitals stabilized, her laughter returned. One afternoon, she walked the length of the hallway with Evan and Nora at her sides. The nurse who had first cared for her cried in the supply room. And for a little while, there was hope again. That night, Evan and Nora walked the hospital parking lot in silence. The air was cool, sweet with the scent of fallen leaves. They reached her car and stood there, neither opening the door. "I keep thinking," he said, "that I wouldn't have survived any of this without you." She shook her head. "You survived because you wanted to live." "No," he said, stepping closer. "I wanted to live because you reminded me it was worth it." She opened her mouth to speak, but he reached up, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that rooted her in place. "I love you, Nora." The words landed not like a surprise, but like something inevitable, like rain finally falling after the sky has carried the weight of it too long. "I love you too," she whispered. He kissed her then, not rushed or desperate, just full of reverence and something like home, like two people who had lost and found themselves in the most impossible of ways. And for the first time in months, maybe years, Nora let herself believe in a future that wasn't just made of sacrifice, but of choosing, again and again, the kind of love that made her feel like more of herself, not less. They stood there a long time, no beeping monitors, no running codes, just breath and skin and the quiet knowledge that some beginnings are born not in moments of certainty, but in the spaces between survival and grace. Winter came in quietly, the hospital windows frosted at the corners, nurses brought out thermoses of cinnamon tea. People started speaking in softer tones as though the season asked them to hold their words gently. In the recovery wing, Nora's days had found a rhythm again. Early mornings, patients with pale hands and tired eyes, moments of laughter blooming between pain. She liked this floor more than she thought she would. The slower pace had made room for something she hadn't realized she'd missed, connection without urgency. Evan came by often now, officially to consult on post-op care for trauma patients, unofficially to see her. No one raised eyebrows anymore. After the board's recommendation and their quiet decision to stay where they were, something shifted in how people spoke of them. Less speculation, more respect. They had chosen honesty, and the hospital, at least the parts that mattered, had accepted it. Tessa was in remission. Her laugh had returned full strength, echoing down corridors even on gray days. Sometimes she and Nora would share coffee near the windows, swapping stories. Tessa loved hearing about Nora's childhood, her mother's cooking, the time she accidentally adopted a stray cat that never stopped judging her. "You're good for him," Tessa said once out of the blue. Nora looked up from her mug. "My brother, you don't make him better," Tessa added. "You make him honest, that's harder. He's not hiding behind ambition anymore." Nora smiled. "I think he's still figuring out who he is." "Yeah, and he's doing it with you, that's the difference." A few weeks before Christmas, Evan brought Nora to an old bookstore on the edge of the city. It was tucked between a bakery and a florist, with windows fogged from heat and the smell of old paper hanging like something sacred in the air. "I used to come here," he said, trailing a finger along the spines. "When I first moved back, after I left rehab after everything. I didn't remember much about myself yet, but I remembered how books made me feel safe." Nora wandered down the nearest aisle, the quiet creaking of the floorboards beneath them grounding her. "Did you read medical books?" "God, no," he said, grinning. "I was trying to remember how to feel human, not robotic. Poetry mostly, travel essays, anything that helped me imagine lives bigger than the one I couldn't recall." He reached into his coat and handed her a small, wrapped package. She raised a brow. "I didn't bring anything for you," she said, caught off guard. "Not about that," he replied. "This isn't a gift, just something that belongs to you." She unwrapped it carefully. It was a journal, leather-bound, soft with use. Inside, his handwriting scrawled in neat, slanted lines. "I started writing after I woke up, not because I thought it'd help, but because I didn't know what else to do with the silence. Most of it's nonsense, half-remembered dreams, questions I never got answers to, but every once in a while there were entries about a nurse." She looked up sharply. "You," he said, "before I knew your name, I'd write things like her hands smell like antiseptic and something warm I can't name, or she speaks softly, like she's trying not to startle the ghosts. I didn't know why you mattered so much back then. I just knew that when you walked into the room, I stopped being afraid." Nora turned a few pages, her throat tight. You were more than my nurse, he said. You were the first thing that felt real. The journal lay heavy in her hands, full of pages she hadn't known existed but somehow already lived in. She closed it slowly. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Evan said. I just wanted you to know that I found you long before I remembered you, and everything since has only made me more sure. They walked out of the bookstore together, the cold air pressing gently against their cheeks. The street smelled like sugar and smoke. Someone nearby was roasting chestnuts. Children laughed somewhere out of sight. A week later, Nora was called into the ER to consult on a patient in post-trauma stabilization. She hadn't been in that room since her transfer. The lights were the same, harsh but necessary. The same faint scuff marks on the floor. It hit her all at once, the memory of that night so many months ago, the man on the table with no name, the drip of her blood moving into his veins. Evan stood across the bed now, a living echo of the man he'd been that night. When they stepped outside together, the hallway quiet behind them, he looked at her with that same steady gaze. Do you ever think about how unlikely it all was? He asked. All the time, she said. He reached for her hand. I don't want to let it be chance anymore. She tilted her head. I want to build a life with you, he said. Not because you saved mine, but because you make it something I want to keep saving every single day. Nora looked at him, heart full. There was no dramatic music, no applause, just the hum of hospital life behind them and the warmth of his hand in hers. And it was enough. In the months that followed, their lives unfolded gently. Tessa moved into a small apartment near the hospital and started volunteering with oncology patients. Evan continued his work as director, but with a new sense of balance. Nora returned to the ER on weekends, splitting her time between trauma and recovery. The nurses joked that she was back to keep Evan humble. She didn't disagree. They moved in together the following spring, in an apartment with wide windows and a kitchen where they cooked on Sundays, the radio humming in the background. They didn't talk about fate or destiny, just choice, love, quiet and constant. Sometimes, when the day was long and the city folded into dusk, Nora would lie beside him and listen to his heartbeat, a rhythm she once saved with a gift that had cost her nothing and meant everything. He had been a stranger, a man with no name, and now he was hers. Not because she gave him blood, because he gave her something far rarer in return. A heart learning how to stay.